After my husband Daniel passed away, his mother Margaret and sister Emily turned on me, accusing me of being a gold digger and trying to push me out of the family. They wanted me to leave and give up any claim to Daniel's property. I fought back, legally and emotionally, gathering evidence and exposing their cruelty. When they finally came to me, begging for forgiveness and asking to end the feud, I realized I didn't need their approval or their family. The house, once a sanctuary of laughter and warmth, now felt like a prison. The walls seemed to close in on me as I stood in the living room, my fingers gripping the edge of the sofa for support. My mother-in-law, Margaret, loomed before me, her eyes blazing with a fury that made my stomach churn. Her words, sharp and venomous, cut through the silence like a whip. "You were never good enough for my son," she spat, her voice trembling with rage. "He should have married someone of my choice, not a gold digger like you. You came into this family with your sweet talk and fake tears, but I always knew what you were after." I felt my chest tighten, my breath catching in my throat. "I loved Daniel," I said, my voice shaking but defiant. "And he loved me. That should be enough for you." "Love?" she scoffed, her lips curling into a sneer. "Don't make me laugh. You trapped him with your lies. And now that he's gone, you think you could just take everything? His property, his money, his life's work? Over my dead body." Emily, my sister-in-law, stepped forward, her arms crossed and her face twisted in disdain. She had always been her mother's shadow, echoing her every word, but tonight, her cruelty felt sharper, more personal. "Mom's right," Emily said, her voice cold and cutting. "You've always been a burden. Daniel was too kind to see it, but we're not blind. You don't deserve a single penny of what's rightfully ours." I felt the tears welling up, but I refused to let them fall. Not in front of them. "Not now. I'm not after anything," I said, my voice firmer this time. "I'm just trying to survive. Daniel was my husband, and I have every right to be here." "Your husband?" Margaret laughed bitterly, the sound echoing through the room. "You were nothing but a mistake he made. If he were alive, he'd regret ever marrying you. You're a curse, a stain on this family." Her words hit me like a slap. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. "How can you say that?" I whispered, my voice breaking. "He loved me. He chose me. And now that he's gone, you're trying to erase me, to pretend I never existed. But I won't let you." Emily stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "You don't belong here. You never did. Why don't you just leave? Go back to wherever you came from. No one wants you here." The room spun around me, their voices echoing in my ears. I felt like I was drowning, suffocating under the weight of their hatred. But then, something inside me snapped. "I'm not going anywhere," I said, my voice low and steady, though my hands trembled. "This is my home too. Daniel left me a part of this family, whether you like it or not. And I'm not going to let you take that away from me." Margaret's face turned red with fury. She stepped forward, her finger jabbing at me like a weapon. "You ungrateful witch. How dare you speak to me like that? After everything I've done for you." "Done for me?" I interrupted, my voice rising. "You've done nothing but make my life hell since Daniel died. You've blamed me, insulted me, and treated me like I'm nothing. Well, I'm done. I'm done with your cruelty, your lies, and your selfishness. I won't let you destroy me anymore." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of my words hanging in the air like a storm about to break. Margaret's face twisted into a mask of pure hatred, her eyes narrowing into slits. "Get out," she hissed, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. "Get out of my house, and don't you dare come back." I looked at her, then at Emily, who stood silently beside her, her eyes cold and unfeeling. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the room, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached the front door, I heard Margaret's voice one last time, sharp and final. "You'll regret this. You'll regret ever crossing me." I didn't look back. I couldn't. The tears finally spilled over as I stepped out into the night, the cool air hitting my face like a slap. The weight of their words crushed me, but beneath the pain, there was something else, a flicker of resolve, a spark of defiance that refused to be extinguished. They had broken me, but I wouldn't let them destroy me. Not anymore. As I walked away from the house, the echoes of their cruelty ringing in my ears, I made a silent promise to myself. I would fight back. I would reclaim what was rightfully mine, and I would never let them see me break. The days after the fight were a blur. I moved through them like a ghost, my mind replaying the cruel words and bitter accusations over and over. But as the initial shock began to fade, memories of the past started to surface, Memories of a time when this house felt like a home and the people in it felt like family. It was hard to believe now, but there had been a time when Margaret wasn't my enemy. When Daniel was alive, she had been cold, yes, but not cruel. She had tolerated me, and I had tried my best to win her over. I remember the first time I met her, standing in this very living room, Daniel's hand warm in mine. "Mom, this is Clara," he had said, his voice filled with pride. "The woman I'm going to marry." Margaret had looked me up and down, her expression unreadable. "Well," she had said after a long pause, "I hope you know what you're getting into, Daniel. Marriage is a serious commitment." I had smiled nervously, determined to make a good impression. "I love your son, Mrs. Thompson," I had said, "and I'll do everything I can to make him happy." She had nodded, but her eyes had remained guarded. "We'll see," she had said. At the time, I had told myself that her coldness was just her way, that she was protective of her son and needed time to warm up to me. And for a while, it seemed like she might. She never went out of her way to be kind, but she wasn't openly hostile either. Emily, on the other hand, had seemed friendly at first. She was younger than Daniel, still in college when we got married, and she had been excited to have a sister-in-law. We had bonded over shared interests and spent hours talking about books, movies, and life. But everything changed after Daniel's death. The accident had been sudden and devastating. One minute, he was there, vibrant, full of life, and the next he was gone. The grief had been unbearable, but what made it worse was the way Margaret and Emily turned on me. It started with small things. Margaret would make snide comments about how I didn't deserve Daniel, how I had been lucky to have him. Emily stopped talking to me altogether, her once friendly eyes now cold and distant. Then came the accusations. They claimed I had married Daniel for his money, that I had never truly loved him. They said I was trying to take over the family business, to push them out of their own lives. At first, I tried to reason with them. "I love Daniel," I would say. "I'm grieving too. Can't we just support each other?" But my words fell on deaf ears. Margaret's resentment grew, and Emily became her mother's shadow, echoing her every word. They blamed me for Daniel's death, as if my presence had cursed him. I remembered one particularly painful conversation, not long after the funeral. Margaret had cornered me in the kitchen, her eyes blazing. "You think you could just waltz in here and take over?" she had hissed. "This is my family, my son. You're nothing but an outsider, and you always will be." I tried to stay calm, to remind myself that she was grieving too, but the words had stung, and they had only gotten worse from there. Now, as I sat alone in the quiet of my room, those memories played on a loop in my mind. I thought about the early days of my marriage, when Daniel had been the bridge between his family and me. He had always made sure I felt included, always stood up for me when his mother or sister said something hurtful. But without him, I was defenseless. I thought about the family dynamics, how they had shifted so dramatically after Daniel's death. Margaret had always been the matriarch, the one in control. But now, her grief had turned into something darker, something more destructive. And Emily, who had once been my friend, had become her mother's enforcer, her loyalty unwavering. I realized then that I had never truly been part of their family. I had been an outsider, a mistake they were determined to erase. But as I sat there, surrounded by the echoes of the past, I also realized something else. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their acceptance. Daniel had loved me, and that was enough. It had to be. The days following the fight with Margaret and Emily were a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, grief, and a simmering sense of injustice churned inside me like a storm. I had tried to be patient, to give them the benefit of the doubt, but their cruelty had crossed a line. It was time to stop being the victim and start fighting back. I began by consulting a lawyer. Daniel had always been meticulous about his will, and I knew he had left me a portion of his estate. But Margaret and Emily were determined to cut me out completely, and I wasn't going to let that happen. The lawyer, a sharp and no-nonsense woman named Laura, listened carefully as I explained the situation. "This isn't just about the money," I told her. "It's about respect. It's about proving that I have a right to be here, that I'm not just some outsider they can push aside." Laura nodded, her expression serious. "We'll fight for what's rightfully yours," she said. "But you need to be prepared. This could get ugly." I was ready. I had nothing left to lose. Over the next few weeks, I began gathering evidence. I recorded conversations with Margaret and Emily, capturing their harsh words and cruel accusations. I dug through old documents, finding proof of my contributions to the family, financial records, photos, even emails from Daniel that showed how much he had loved and trusted me. I also reached out to people who had witnessed their behavior. Neighbors, friends, even the housekeeper who had worked for the family for years. Many of them were hesitant to get involved, but a few were willing to speak up. One evening, I met with Sarah, a neighbor who had always been kind to me. We sat in her cozy living room, cups of tea in hand, as I explained what was happening. "I can't believe they're treating you like this," Sarah said, her eyes filled with sympathy. "You've been through so much already. They should be supporting you, not tearing you down." "I know," I said, my voice steady, "but they've made it clear that they don't see me as family. I need to protect myself." Sarah nodded. "I'll help however I can. I've heard the way Margaret talks about you, and it's not right. You deserve better." Her words gave me strength. I wasn't alone in this. As the evidence piled up, I began to feel a sense of power I hadn't felt in a long time. I wasn't just fighting for money or property. I was fighting for my dignity, for the life Daniel and I had built together. But I didn't stop there. I knew that Margaret and Emily cared deeply about their reputation, about how they were perceived by others. So I decided to hit them where it hurt. I started by sharing my story with a few close friends in our social circle. At first, they were shocked. Margaret had always been so poised, so respected. But as I showed them the evidence, their shock turned to outrage. "How could they treat you like this?" one friend asked, her voice filled with anger. "After everything you've been through?" "I don't know," I said quietly, "but I'm not going to let them get away with it." Word began to spread. Margaret and Emily's once impeccable reputation started to crumble. People who had once admired them now saw them for what they truly were: cruel, vindictive, and selfish. The final blow came when I decided to go public. I wrote a heartfelt post on social media, sharing my story with the world. I didn't name names, but it was clear who I was talking about. The response was overwhelming. Messages of support poured in from friends, acquaintances, and even strangers. People were outraged on my behalf, and many of them shared their own stories of being mistreated by Margaret and Emily. It didn't take long for the backlash to reach them. Margaret called me one evening, her voice trembling with anger. "How dare you?" she hissed. "How dare you drag our family's name through the mud?" "I didn't drag your name through the mud," I said calmly. "You did that yourself. I just told the truth." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then, in a voice I barely recognized, Margaret said, "You'll regret this." But I didn't regret it. Not one bit. As I hung up the phone, I felt a sense of satisfaction I hadn't felt in months. The seeds of revenge had been planted, and they were starting to grow. Margaret and Emily had tried to break me, but they had only made me stronger. And I wasn't done yet. The fallout from my social media post was swift and unrelenting. Margaret and Emily's carefully constructed facade of respectability crumbled under the weight of public scrutiny. Friends and acquaintances who had once admired them now viewed them with suspicion and disdain. The phone calls and messages of support I received were a stark contrast to the silence that now surrounded them. But it wasn't just their reputation that suffered. The legal battle over Daniel's estate was taking its toll. The mounting legal fees and the stress of the case were draining them, financially and emotionally. I could see it in the way Margaret's voice trembled during our rare phone calls, in the way Emily's once confident demeanor had turned brittle and defensive. Still, I didn't expect what happened next. One evening, as I sat in my small apartment, there was a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and my heart raced as I peered through the peephole. Standing there, looking smaller and more vulnerable than I had ever seen them, were Margaret and Emily. I hesitated for a moment, then opened the door. "Clara," Margaret began, her voice shaky and unfamiliar. "Can we come in?" I stepped aside, letting them enter. They looked out of place in my modest living room, their designer clothes and expensive handbags a stark contrast to the simple furniture and bare walls. Margaret sat on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Emily stood behind her, her arms crossed, her eyes darting around the room as if she couldn't bear to look at me. "We need to talk," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. I crossed my arms and leaned against the wall, waiting. Margaret took a deep breath. "We were wrong," she said, the words seeming to cost her dearly. We let our grief cloud our judgment. We treated you terribly, and we're sorry." I raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "You're sorry?" "Yes," she said, her voice trembling. "We realize now that we've been unfair to you. Daniel loved you, and you were his wife. You're part of this family, whether we like it or not." Emily stepped forward, her face pale and drawn. "We've been under a lot of stress," she said, her voice tight. The legal battle, the public backlash, it's been too much. We just want to put this behind us. I stared at them, my mind racing. This was the last thing I had expected. Margaret and Emily, humbled and apologetic, standing in my living room and begging for forgiveness. But I wasn't ready to let them off the hook. "You've been under stress?" I said, my voice cold. "What about me? Do you have any idea what it's been like for me? Losing Daniel, dealing with your cruelty, fighting for what's rightfully mine? You don't get to come here and act like the victims." Margaret flinched, but she didn't argue. "You're right," she said quietly. "We've been selfish. We've been wrong. But we're here now, and we're asking for your help." "My help?" I repeated, incredulous. "Yes," Emily said, her voice breaking. "We can't keep fighting like this. It's tearing us apart. We need to end this legal battle, to find a way to move forward. Together." I laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "Together? You've spent months trying to destroy me, and now you want us to be a family? Do you really think it's that easy?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine remorse. "No," she said. "I don't think it's easy, but I'm asking you to try. For Daniel's sake." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. Daniel, the man who had loved us all, who had brought us together in the first place. I thought about what he would want, how he would feel if he could see us now. But then I thought about everything I had been through, the pain, the betrayal, the fight to reclaim my dignity. I thought about the nights I'd spent crying myself to sleep, the days I'd spent battling their cruelty. And I realized that no matter what they said, no matter how much they apologized, things could never go back to the way they were. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice steady, "but I can't do this. I can't pretend that everything's okay, that we can just move on like nothing happened. You've hurt me too much." Margaret's face crumpled, and Emily looked away, her jaw clenched. "Please," Margaret whispered, "we're family." "No," I said, my voice firm. "We're not." There was a long, heavy silence. Then, slowly, Margaret stood up, her shoulders slumped in defeat. Emily followed, her face pale and expressionless. They walked to the door, and, as Margaret reached for the handle, she turned back to me. "I hope you can forgive us one day," she said quietly. I didn't respond. As the door closed behind them, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, sadness, and a quiet sense of triumph. The tables had turned, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control. But I also knew that this wasn't the end. The meeting with Margaret and Emily marked a turning point. Their apologies, though unexpected, had only solidified my resolve. I had spent months fighting for my place in Daniel's life, in his family, and in his legacy. But now, I realized that I didn't need their approval or their acceptance. I didn't need to be part of their world anymore. The legal battle over Daniel's estate was settled shortly after their visit. Thanks to the evidence I had gathered and the support of my lawyer, Laura, I was awarded my rightful share of the property and assets. It wasn't everything I'd hoped for, but it was enough. Enough to start over. Enough to build a new life. I sold my share of the house and the family business, cutting ties with the past completely. The money gave me freedom. Freedom to leave the town that had become a prison. Freedom to escape the memories and the pain. I moved to a new city, a place where no one knew me or my story. I found a small apartment with big windows that let in the sunlight, and I filled it with things that made me happy: books, plants, and photos of Daniel. Not the Daniel who had been taken from me too soon, but the Daniel who had loved me, who had believed in me. The first few weeks were strange. I had spent so long fighting, so long surviving, that I didn't know what to do with the quiet. But slowly, I began to find my footing. I started writing again, something I hadn't done since Daniel's death. I took long walks in the park, savoring the simple pleasure of being alone with my thoughts. I even made a few friends, people who didn't know about my past, who liked me for who I was now. But Margaret and Emily weren't ready to let go. They called me a few times, their voices pleading, their words filled with regret. "Clara, please," Margaret said during one call. "We've lost so much. Don't make us lose you too." I listened, but I didn't respond. I had nothing left to say to them. Emily tried too, her tone softer than I had ever heard it. "I know we hurt you," she said, "but we're family. Can't we just start over?" "No," I said simply. "We can't." And then I hung up. It wasn't easy. There were moments when I wavered, when the weight of everything I lost threatened to pull me under. But I reminded myself of the promises I had made, to Daniel, to myself. I had fought too hard to let them back in. One day, as I sat by the window with a cup of tea, I realized something. I was happy. Not the kind of happiness I had known with Daniel, but a quieter, steadier kind. It was a happiness born of survival, of resilience, of knowing that I had faced the worst and come out stronger. I thought about Margaret and Emily, about the life I had left behind. I didn't hate them anymore. I didn't feel much of anything for them. They were part of a chapter in my life that had ended, a chapter one had no desire to revisit. I had finally broken free, and I was never looking back.